Good evening, and welcome to Tales and Cocktails. Tonight we continue with BRAT FARRAR by Josephine Tey, and this is part 6. Excuse me. In the library, as the voices of B and Mr. McCallan faded down the hall and into the out-of-doors, there was silence. Brat, uncertain of the quality of that silence, turned to the shelves and began to consider the books. "Well," said Simon, lounging in the window, "another hazard safely negotiated." Brat waited, trying to analyze the sound of the words while they still hung in the air. "Hazard?" he said at length. "The snags and bunkers and the difficult business of coming back. It must have taken some nerve, all things considered. What moved you to it, Brat? Homesickness?" This was the first frank question he had been asked, and he suddenly liked Ashby the better for it. "Not exactly. A realization that my place was here after all." He felt that had a self-righteous sound and added, "I mean that my place in the world was here." This was succeeded by another silence. Brat went on looking at books and hoped that he was not going to like young Ashby. That would be an unforeseen complication. It was bad enough not to be able to face the person he was supplanting, now that he was left alone in a room with him, but to find himself liking that person would make the situation intolerable. It was B who broke the silence. "I think we should have offered the poor little man a drink," she said, coming in. "However, it's too late now. He can get one from his contact at the White Hart." "The Bell, I suspect," Simon said. "Why the Bell? Our Lana frequents that in preference to the White Hart." "Ah, well, the sooner everyone knows, the sooner the fuss will be over." She smiled at Brat to take any sting from the words. "Let's go and look at the horses, shall we? Have you any riding clothes with you, Brat?" "Not any that Latchets would recognize as riding clothes," Brat said, noticing how thankfully she seized on the excuse not to call him Patrick. "Come up with me," Simon said, "and I'll find you something." "Good," said B, looking pleased with him. "I'll collect Eleanor." "You like being given the old night nursery?" Simon asked, preceding Brat upstairs. "Very much." "Same old paper, I suppose you noticed?" "Yes." "Do you remember the night we had an Ivanhoe Hereward battle?" "No, I don't remember that." "No, of course you wouldn't." Again the words hung on the silence, teasing Brat's ear with an echo of their tone. He followed young Ashby into the room he had shared with his brother and noticed that there was no suggestion in the room that it had ever been shared by another person. It was, on the contrary, very much Simon's own room, being furnished with his possessions to an extent that made it as much a sitting room as a bedroom. Shelves of books, rows of silver cups, framed sketches of horses on the walls, easy chairs, and a small desk with a telephone extension on it. Brat moved over to the window while Simon rummaged among his clothes for appropriate garments. The window, as he knew, looked over the stables, but a green hedge of lilac and laburnum trees hid the buildings from view. Above them, in the middle distance, rose the tower of Clare Church. On Sunday, he supposed, he would be taken to service there. Another hazard. Hazard had been an odd word for young Ashby to choose, surely. Simon emerged from the cupboard with breeches and a tweed coat. "I think these ought to do," he said, throwing them on the bed. "I'll find you a shirt." He opened a drawer of the closet, of the chest, which held his dressing mirror and toilet things. The chest stood by the window, and Brat, still uneasy in Ashby's vicinity, moved over to the fireplace and began to look at the silver cups on the mantelpiece. All of them were prizes for horsemanship, and they ranged from a hurdle race at the local point-to-point to Olympia. All of them except one were of a date too late to have concerned Patrick Ashby, the exception being a small and humble chalice that had been awarded to Simon Ashby on patience for being the winner of the juvenile jumping class at the Burr's agricultural show in the year before Patrick Ashby committed suicide. Simon, looking round and seeing this small cup in Brat's hand, smiled and said, "I took that from you, if you remember." "From me?" Brat said, unprepared. "Yes, you would have won on old Harry if I hadn't done you out of it by doing a perfect second round." "Oh, yes," Brat said. And to lay a new scent, "You seem to have done well for yourself since." "Not badly," Simon said, his attention going back to his shirt drawer. "But I'm going to do a lot better. Ballsbridge and all stops to Olympia." It was said absent-mindedly, but with confidence, as if the money to buy good horseflesh would automatically be available. Brat wondered a little, but felt that this was no moment for discussing the financial future. "Do you remember the object that used to hang at the end of your bed?" Simon asked casually, pushing the shirt drawer shut. "The little horse?" Brat said. "Yes, of course. Travesty," he said, giving its name and mock reading, "by Irish peasant out of Bog Oak." He turned from the exhibits on the mantelpiece, meaning to collect the clothes that Ashby had looked out for him. But as he turned, he saw Ashby's face in the mirror, and the naked shock on that face stopped him in his tracks. Simon had been in the act of pushing the drawer shut, but the action was arrested halfway. It was, thought Brat, exactly the reaction of someone who has heard a telephone ring. The involuntary pause, and then the resumed movement. Simon turned to face him, slowly, the shirt hanging over his left forearm. "I think you'll find that all right," he said, taking the shirt in his right hand and holding it out to Brat, but keeping his eyes on Brat's face. His expression was no longer shocked. He merely looked blank, as if his mind were elsewhere. As if, Brat thought, he were doing sums in his head. Brat took the shirt, collected the rest of the clothes, expressed his thanks, and made for the door. "Come down when you're ready," Simon said, still staring at him in that blank way. "We'll be waiting for you." And Brat, making his way round the landing to his own room in the opposite wing, was shocked in his turn. Ashby hadn't expected him to know that. Ashby had been so certain indeed that he would not know about the toy horse, that he had been rocked back on his heels when it was clear that he did know about it. And that meant it could mean only one thing. It meant that young Ashby had not believed for a moment that he was Patrick. Brat shut the door of the peaceful old night nursery behind him and stood leaning against it, the clothes cascading slowly to the ground from his slackened arm. Simon had not been fooled. That touching little scene over the sherry glasses had been only an act. It was a staggering thought. Why had Simon bothered to pretend? Why had he not said at once, "You are not Patrick, and nothing will make me believe that you are"? That had been his original line, if Lana's report and the family atmosphere meant anything. Up to the last moment, they had been unsure of his reaction to Brat's arrival, and he had gratified them all by a frank and charming capitulation. Why the gratuitous capitulation? Was it a trap of some sort? Were the welcome and the charm merely the grass and green leaves laid over a pit he had prepared? But he could not have known until the actual face-to-face meeting that he, Brat, was not Patrick. And he had apparently known instantly that the person he was facing was not his brother. Why then should he? Brat stooped to pick up the clothes from the floor and straightened himself abruptly. He had remembered something. He had remembered that odd relaxing on Simon's part, the moment he had had a good look at himself, that suggestion of relief, of being let off. So that was it. Simon had been afraid that it was Patrick. When he found that he was faced with a mere impostor, he must have had difficulty in refraining from embracing him. But that still did not explain the capitulation. Perhaps it was a mere postponement, a setting to partners. It might be that he planned a more dramatic denouement, a more public discrediting. If that was so, Brat thought, there were a few surprises in store for young Mr. Ashby. The more he thought about the surprises, the better he began to feel about things. As he changed into riding clothes, he recalled with something like pleasure that shocked face in the mirror. Simon had been unaware that he, Brat, had passed any family tests. He had not been present when Brat passed the searching test of knowing his way about the house, and he had not had any chance of being told about it. All that he knew was that Brat had satisfied the lawyers of his identity. Having been faced with, to him, an obvious impostor, he must have looked forward with a delighted malice to baiting the pretender. Yes, all ready to pull the wings off flies was young Mr. Ashby. The first tentative pull had been about the Ivanhoe-Hereward battle, something that only Patrick would know about, but something, too, that he might easily have forgotten. The little wooden horse was something that only Patrick would know about, and something that Patrick could in no circumstances have forgotten. And Brat had known about it. Not much wonder that Ashby had been shocked and at sea. Not much wonder that he looked as if he were doing sums in his head. Brat spared a kind thought for that master tutor, Alec Loading. Loading had missed his vocation. As a coach, he was superb. Sometime, somewhere, something was going to turn up that Alec Loading had either forgotten to tell him about or had not himself known. And the moment was going to be a very sticky one. But so far he had known his lines. So far he was perfect. Even to the point of travesty. A little object of black bog oak it had been. Rudimentary and surrealist, Loading had said, but recognizable as a horse. It had originally been yoked to a jaunting car, the whole turnout being one of those bog oak souvenirs that tourists brought back from Ireland in the days before it was more advisable to bring home the bacon. The small car, being made of bits and pieces, soon went the way of all nursery objects. But the little horse, chunky and solid, had survived and had become Patrick's halidom and fetish. It was Alec Loading who had been responsible for naming it, one winter evening over nursery tea. He and Nancy had looked in at Latchett's on their way home from some pony races, hoping for a drink. But finding no one at home except Nora, who was having tea upstairs with her children, they had joined the nursery party. And there, while they made toast, they had sought a name for Patrick's talisman. Patrick, who always referred to the object as my little Irish horse, and was conscious of no need for a more particular description, rejected all suggestions. "What would you call it, Alec?" his mother asked, gloating, who had been too busy consuming buttered toast to care what a toy was called. "Travesty," Alec had said, eyeing the thing, "by Irish peasant out of Bog Oak." The grown-ups had laughed, but Patrick, who was too young to know the meaning of the word, thought that travesty was a fine, proud-sounding name. A name filled with the tramplings and prancings and curvettings of war horses, and worthy, therefore, of the little black object of his love. He kept it in a pocket, Loading had said, in Queen Adelaide's sitting room. It was raining that morning. But when he grew too big for that, it hung on a frayed Stuart tartan ribbon off a box of Edinburgh rock at the end of his bed. Yes, not much wonder that Simon had been shaken to the core. No stranger to the Ashby family could have known about travesty. Brat, buttoning himself into Ashby garments and noticing how a well-cut article adapts itself even to an alien figure, wondered what Simon was making of the problem. He had no doubt learned by now that the impostor not only knew about the existence of travesty, but had walked about the house with the confidence of long acquaintance. A faint flare of excitement woke in Brat, the same excitement that had made those interviews with old Mr. Sandal so enjoyable. For the last couple of hours, ever since his arrival at Guestgate Station, he had been received with kindness and welcome, and the result had been a faint queasiness, a sort of spiritual indigestion. What had been a dice game for dangerous stakes had become a mere taking candy from a baby. Now that Simon was his opponent, the thing was once more a contest. Not dice, thought Brat, considering himself in the mirror. Checkers, rather. A matter of cautious moves, of anticipating attack, of blocking an unforeseen threat. Yes, checkers. Brat went downstairs buoyed up with a new anticipation. He would not any more have to stand with his back to young Ashby because he was unable to face him. The pieces were laid out on the board, and they faced each other across it. Through the wide open door of the hall, he could see the Ashbys grouped in the sunlight on the steps and went forward to join them. Ruth, with her chronically roving eye, was the first to see him. "Oh, doesn't he look nice?" said Ruth, still paying court. Brat was aware that he looked nice, but wished that Ruth had not called attention to his borrowed finery. He wondered if anyone had ever smacked Ruth Ashby. "You must get some riding clothes from Walter's as soon as may be," Bee said. "These are almost a good enough fit to do as a pattern, which would save you having to go to town for measurements only." "Those breeches aren't Walter's," Simon said, eyeing the clothes lazily. "They're Gore and Bowen's." "Bowen's? Walter's never made a good pair of breeches in his life." He was draped against the wall by the doorway, relaxed, and apparently at peace with the world. His eyes traveled slowly up from Brat's boots to his shirt and came to rest with the same detached interest on his face. "Well," he said amiably, pushing himself off the wall, "let's go and look at some horses." Not checkers, thought Brat. No, not checkers. Poker. "We'll show you the stables this afternoon," Bee said, and leave the mares until after tea. She ran an arm through Brat's and gathered Simon in with her other one, so that they went toward the stables arm in arm like old friends, Eleanor and the twins following along behind. "Greg is all agog to see you," she said. "Not that you'll notice any agogness, of course. His face doesn't permit anything like that. You'll just have to believe me that he is excited inside." "What happened to old Malpas?" Brat asked, although he had heard all about old Malpas one afternoon outside the orangery. "He became very astigmatic," Bee said, figuratively speaking. "We could never see eye to eye. He didn't really like taking orders from a woman, so he retired about 18 months after I took over. And we've had Greg ever since. He's a misanthropist and a misogynist, and he has his perks, of course, but he doesn't let any of them interfere with the running of the stables. There was a noted drop in the fodder bills after old Malpas left, and the local people like Greg better because he buys his hay direct from the farmers and not through a contractor. And I think on the whole he's a better horse master than Malpas was, cleverer at getting a poor horse into condition, and a genius at doctoring a sick one." "Why doesn't he relax?" she was thinking, feeling the boy's arm rigid under her fingers. "The ordeal is over now, surely. Why doesn't he relax?" And Brat, for his part, was conscious of her fingers clasping his forearm as he had never been conscious before of a woman's hand. He was experiencing again that surge of an unrecognized emotion that had filled him when Bee had taken his hand to lead him to the interview with Mr. McCallan. But his first sight of the stables distracted his attention from both emotional and ethical problems. His reaction to the stable yard at Latchett's was very much the reaction of a merchant seaman to his first acquaintance with one of His Majesty's ships, a sort of contemptuous but kindly amusement, a wonder that the thing wasn't finished off with ribbons. Only the fact that several horses' heads protruded inquisitively from the loose boxes convinced him that the place was seriously used as a stable at all. It was like nothing so much as one of the toy models he had seen in expensive toy shops. He had always imagined that those gay little affairs with their bright paint and their flowers in tubs had been manufactured to a child's taste. But apparently they had been authentic copies of an actual article. He was looking at one of the articles at this moment and being very much surprised. Not even the Dude Ranch had prepared him for this. There was paint galore at the Dude Ranch, but there was also a tradition of toughness. The Dude Ranch would never have thought of mowing the bit of grass in the middle until it looked like a square of green baize, so neat-edged and trim that it looked as if you could roll it up and take it away. At the Dude Ranch, there was still a suggestion of the mud, dung, sweat, and flies which are inseparable from a life alongside horseflesh. The little building on the left of the yard entrance was the saddle room, and in the saddle room door was the stud groom, Greg. Greg had in the highest degree that disillusioned air common to those who make their living out of horses. He had also the horseman's quality of agelessness. He was probably 50, but it would not be surprising to be told that he was 35. He took 2 paces forward and waited for them to come up to him. The 2 paces were his concession to good manners, and the waiting emphasized the fact that he was receiving them on his own ground. His clear blue eyes ran over Brat as Bee introduced them, but his expression remained polite and inscrutable. He gave Brat a conventional welcome and a crushing hand clasp. "I hear you've been riding horses in America," he said. "Only Western ones," Brat said. working horses. Oh, these work, Greg said, inclining his head towards the boxes. Don't be in any doubt about it, the tone said. It was as if he had understood Brat's distrust of the spit and polish. His eyes went past Brat to Eleanor, standing behind, and he said, "Have you seen what's in the saddle room, Miss Eleanor?" From the gloom of the saddle room, there materialized, as if in answer to his question, the figure of a small boy. He materialized rather reluctantly, as if uncertain of his welcome. In spite of a change of costume, Brat recognized him as the rider of the stone lion at the gates of Clare. His present apparel, though less startling, was hardly more orthodox than his leopard skin outfit. He was wearing a striped football jersey that clung to his tadpole body, a pair of jumpers so large that they hung in a fold above each skinny knee, a steeple-chasing jockey cap with the crash lining showing at the back, and a pair of grubby red moccasins. "Tony," said Eleanor. "Tony, what are you doing here?" "I've come for my ride," said Tony, his eyes darting to and fro among the group like lizards. "But this isn't the day for your ride." "Isn't it, Eleanor? I thought it was. You know quite well that you don't ride on a Tuesday." "I thought this was Wednesday." "You're a dreadful little liar, Tony," Eleanor said dispassionately. "You knew quite well this wasn't Wednesday. You just saw me in a car with a stranger, and so you came along to find out who the stranger was." "Eleanor," murmured Bea, deprecating. "You don't know him," Eleanor said, as if the subject of discussion was not present. "His curiosity amounts to a mania. It's almost his only human attribute." "If you take him today, you won't have to take him tomorrow," Simon said, eyeing the Toselli child with distaste. "He can't come and expect to ride just when he feels like it," Eleanor said. "Besides, I said I wouldn't take him out again in those things. I told you to get a pair of boots, Tony." The black eyes stopped being lizards and became two brimming pools of grief. "My father can't afford boots for me," said Tony with a catch in his alto, guaranteed to draw blood from the stone. "Your father has £12,000 a year free of income tax," Eleanor said briskly. "If you took him today, Nell," Bea said, "you'd be free to help me tomorrow when half the countryside comes dropping in to have a look at Brat." And as Eleanor hesitated, "You might as well get it over now that he's here." "And he'll still be wearing moccasins tomorrow," Simon drawled. "Indian riders wear moccasins," Tony observed mildly, "and they are very good riders." "I don't think your destitute father would be very pleased if you turned up with moccasins in the row. You get a pair of boots. And if I take you this afternoon, Tony, you are not to think that you can make a habit of this. Oh, no, Eleanor. If you come on the wrong day again, you'll just have to go away without a ride." "Yes, Eleanor." The eyes were lizards again, darting and sliding. "All right. Go and ask Arthur to saddle Spuds for you." "Yes, Eleanor." "No thanks, you'll observe," Eleanor said, watching him go. "What is the crash helmet for?" Simon asked. "His skull is as thin as cellophane," he says, "and must be protected. I don't know how he got one that size. Out of a circus, I should imagine. What with his Indian longings, I suppose I should be thankful that he doesn't turn up in a headband and a single feather." "He will one day, when it occurs to him," Simon said. "Oh, well, I suppose I'd better go and saddle Buster." "I'm sorry, Brat," she said, smiling a little at him, "but it is really one of those blessings in disguise. The pony he rides will be a lot less fresh with him today than he would be tomorrow after a day in the stable. And you don't really need 3 people to show you around. I'll go round the paddocks with you after tea." Brat's tendency to be patronizing about spit and polish died painlessly and permanently, somewhere between the 4th and 5th boxes. The pampered darlings that he had been prepared to find in those boxes did not exist. Thoroughbred, half-bred, cob, or pony, the shine on their coats came from condition and grooming, and not from coddling in warm stables. Brat had lived long enough with horses to recognize that. The only ribbons that had ever been tied on these animals were rosettes of red or blue or yellow, and the rosettes were quite properly in the saddle room. Bee did the honors, with Greg as assistant, but since it is not possible for 4 horsemen to consider any given horse without entering into a discussion, the occasion soon lost the slight formality of its beginnings and degenerated into a friendly free-for-all. And presently Brat, always a little detached from his surroundings, noticed that Bee was leaving the discussion more and more to Simon. That it was Simon instead of Bee who said, "This is a throw-out from a racing stable that Eleanor is schooling into a hack," or, "Do you remember old Thora? This is a son of hers by cold steel." That Bee was quite deliberately edging herself out. The twins had soon grown tired and evaporated. Ruth because horses bored her, and Jane because she knew all that was to be known about the horses, and did not like the thought that they belonged to a person she did not know. And Greg, congenitally taciturn, fell more and more into the background with Bee, so that in no time at all it was Simon's occasion, Simon's and Brat's. Simon behaved as if he had not a care in the world, as if this were just another afternoon, and Brat was just another visitor, a rather privileged and knowledgeable visitor, unquestionably welcome. Brat, coming to the surface every now and then from his beguilement with the horses, would listen to the light drawl discussing pedigree, confirmation, character, or prospects, would watch the cool, untroubled profile and wonder. "A bit light in front," the cool voice would be saying, and the untroubled eyes would be running over the animal as if no more important matter clouded the sun. "Nice, though, don't you think?" Or, "This one should really be turned out. He's been hunted all the winter, but I'm going pot hunting on him this summer. And anyway, Bee's awfully stingy with her pasture." And Bee would put in her tuppence worth and fade out again. It was Bee who ran Latchett's, but the various interests involved were divided between the 3 Ashbys. Eleanor's chief concerns were the hacks and hunters. Simon's were hunters and show jumpers, and Bee's were the mares and the Shetland ponies. During Bill Ashby's lifetime, when Latchett's was purely a breeding establishment, the hacks and hunters in the stables had been there for family use and amusement. Occasionally, when there happened to be an extra good horse in the stable, Bee, who was a better horsewoman than her brother, would come down from London for a week or 2 to school it, and afterward show it for him. It was good advertisement for Latchett's. Not because Latchett's ever dealt in made horses, but because the simple repetition of a name is of value in the commercial world, as the writers of advertisements have discovered. Nowadays, the younger Ashbys, under Bee's supervision, had turned the stables into a profitable rival to the brood mares. "Mr. Gates is asking if he can speak to you, sir," said the stableman to Greg, and Greg excused himself and went back to the saddle room. Four-poster came to the door of his box, stared coldly at Brat for a moment, and then nudged him jocosely with his Roman nose. "Has he always been Jane's?" Brat asked. "No," Bee said. "He was bought for Simon's 14th birthday. But Simon grew so fast that in a year or so he had outgrown him, and Jane, at 4, was already clamoring to ride a real horse instead of a Shetland. So she fell heir to him. If he ever had any manners, he has forgotten them, but he and Jane seemed to understand each other. Greg came back to say that it was Miss Ashby that Gates wanted to see. It was about the fencing. "All right, I'll come," Bea said. And as Greg went away, "What he really wants to see is Brat, but he'll just wait until tomorrow, like the rest of the countryside." It's so like Gates to try to steal a march. Opportunism is his middle name. If you two go trying out any of the horses, do be back for tea. I want to go round the paddocks with Brat before it gets dark. "Do you remember Gates?" Simon asked, opening the door of another box. "No, I don't think so. He's the tenant of Wixell." "What became of Vidler, then?" "He died. This man was married to his daughter and had a small farm the other side of Burrs." Well, Simon had dealt him the cards he needed that time. He looked at Simon to see how he had taken it, but Simon's whole interest seemed to be in the horse he was leading out of the box. "These last 3 boxes are all new acquisitions, bought with an eye on the show ring. But this is the pick of the bunch. He's a 4-year-old by Highwood out of a mare called Shout Aloud. His name is Timber." Timber was a black without a brown hair on him. He had a rudimentary white star and a ring of white on each coronet, and he was quite the handsomest thing in horseflesh that Brat had ever been in close quarters with. He came out of his box with an air of benevolent condescension, as if aware of his good looks and pleased that they should be the subject of tribute. There was something oddly demure about him, Brat thought, watching him. Perhaps it was just the way he was standing, with his 4 feet close together. Whatever it was, it didn't go with the self-confident, considering eye. "Difficult to fault, isn't he?" Simon said. Brat, lost in admiration of his physical conformation, was still puzzled by what he thought of as the butter wouldn't melt air. "He has one of the best-looking heads I've ever seen on a horse," Simon said. "And just look at the bone." He led the horse round. "And a sweet mover, too," he said. Brat went on looking in silence, admiring and puzzled. "Well," Simon said, waiting for Brat's comment. "Isn't he conceited?" said Brat. Simon laughed. "Yes, I suppose he is, but not without cause. No, he's a good looker, all right. He is more than that. He's a lovely ride, and he can jump anything you can see the sky over." Brat moved forward to the horse and made friendly overtures. Timber accepted the gesture without responding. He looked gratified, but faintly bored. "He should have been a tenor," Brat said. "A tenor?" Simon said. "Oh, I see. The conceit." He considered the horse afresh. "I suppose he is rather pleased with himself. I hadn't thought about it before. Would you like to try him out, by the way?" "I certainly would. He ought to have some exercise today, and he hasn't so far." He hailed a stableman. "Arthur, bring a saddle for Timber." "Yes, sir." "A double bridle, sir?" "No, a snaffle." And as the man went to Brat, "He has a mouth like a glove." Brat wondered if he was merely reluctant to submit that tender mouth to the ham hands of a Westerner with a cur brain at his disposal. While Timber was being saddled, they inspected the 2 remaining acquisitions. They were a long-backed bay, a bay mare with a good head and quarters, 2 good ends make up for a middle, as Simon said, who was called a scapper, and Chevron, a bright chestnut of great quality with a nervous eye. "What are you riding?" Brat asked, as Simon led Chevron back to his box. Simon bolted the half-door and turned to face him. "I thought you might like to have a look around by yourself," he said. And as Brat, surprised by this piece of luck, was momentarily wordless, Don't let him get lit up too much, will you? Or he'll break out again when he has been dried. No, I'll bring him back cool, Brat said, and flung his leg across his first English horse. He took one of the 2 whips that Arthur was holding out for his choosing and turned the horse to the inner end of the yard. "Where are you going?" Simon asked, as if surprised. "Up to the down, I think," Brat said, as if Simon's question had applied to his choice of a place to ride in. If that gate at the northwest corner of the yard didn't still lead to the shortcut to the downs, then Simon would have to tell him. If it did still lead there, Simon would have one more item to worry about. "You haven't chosen a very good whip for shutting gates with," Simon said smoothly. "Or are you going to jump everything you come to? You rodeo artist," the tone said. "I'll shut the gates," Brat said equably. He began to walk Timber to the corner of the yard. "He has his tricks, so look out for him," Simon said, as an afterthought. "I'll look out for him," Brat said, and rode away to the inner gate, where Arthur was waiting to open it for him. Arthur grinned at him in a friendly fashion and said admiringly, "He's a fly one, that, sir." As he turned to his right into the little lane, he considered the implication of that very English adjective. It was a long time since he had heard anything called fly. Fly was cute, in the English sense, not in the American. Fly was something on the side, a fly cup, something sly, with a hint of cleverness in it. A fly one, Timber was. The fly one walked composedly up the track between the green banks netted with violets, his ears erect in anticipation of the turf ahead of them. As they came in sight of the gate at the far end, he danced a little. "No," said Brat's hands, and he desisted at once. Someone had left the gate open, but since there was a notice saying, "Please shut the gate," neatly painted in the middle of it, Brat maneuvered Timber into the appropriate position for closing it. Timber seemed as well acquainted with gates and their uses as a cowpony was with a rope. But never before had Brat had so delicate and so well-oiled a mechanism under him. Timber obeyed the slightest indication of hand or heel with a lack of questioning and a confidence that was new in Brat's experience. Surprised and delighted, Brat experimented with this new adaptability. And Timber, even with the turf in front of him, with the turf practically under his feet, moved sweetly and obediently under his hands. "You wonder," said Brat softly. The ears flicked at him. "You perishing marvel," he said, and closed his knees as he turned to face the down. Timber broke into a slow canter, headed for the clumps of gorse and juniper bushes that marked the skyline. So this was what riding a good English horse was like, he thought. This communion, this being one half of a whole, this effortlessness, this magic. The close, fine turf slipped by under them, and it was odd to see no little spurt of dust coming up as the shoes struck. "England, England, England," said the shoes as they struck, a soft drum on the English turf. "I don't care," he thought. "I don't care. I'm a criminal and a heel, but I've got what I wanted, and it's worth it. By God, it's worth it. If I died tomorrow, it's worth it." They came to the level top of the down and faced the double row of bushes that made a rough, natural avenue, some 50 yards wide, along the crest. This was something that Alec Loading had forgotten to tell him about, and something that had not appeared on a map. Even the Ordnance Survey could hardly take note of juniper growths. He pulled up to consider it, but Timber was in no considering mood. Timber knew all about that level stretch of down between the rows of bushes. "All right," said Brat, "let's see what you can do," and let him go. Brat had ridden flyers before, dozens of them. He had ridden sprinters and had won money with them. He had been bolted with at the speed of jet propulsion. Mere speed no longer surprised him. What surprised him was the smoothness of the progress. It was like being carried through the air on a horse suspended on a merry-go-round. The soft air parted round his face and tickled his ears and fled away behind them, smelling of grass with the sun on it, and heather and gorse. Who cares? Who cares? Who cares? Said the galloping feet. Who cares? Who cares? Who cares? Said the blood in Brat's veins. If he died tomorrow, it was all the same to him. As they came to the end of the stretch, Timber began to pull up of his own accord, but it was against Brat's instincts to let a horse make the decisions. So he kept him going, turned him round the south end of the green corridor, and counted him gently to a walk. And Timber responded without question. "Brother," said Brat, running his fingers up the dark crest, "are there more like you in England, or do you rate special?" Timber bent his head to the caress, still with the air of one receiving his due. But as they walked back on the south side of the irregular green hedge, Brat's attention and interest went to the countryside spread below him. Except that he was looking at it upside down, as it were, from the north instead of from the south, as one looks normally at a map, this was Clare, as he had first become acquainted with it, all laid out below his eye in ordnance survey clarity and precision. And that, my dears, is part 6. Because I don't think we're going to be able, well, hang on with me. We may be able to get to the end of this chapter. It's just another page. Down below him, a little to the left, were the crimson roofs of latchets set in the neat squares of paddock. Farther to the left was the church on its own small rise, and left of it again the village of Clare, a huddle of roofs in pale green trees. Where the land sloped up from the village to make the south side of the small valley stood Clare Park, a long white house sheltered from the southwest channel gales by the slope behind it. Directly opposite him, that slope rose into a smaller and tamer version of the down he was sitting on, a low green hill called Tanbitches. It was an open stretch of grazing, marked halfway up with the green scar of an old quarry, and crowned by the beeches that had given it its name. There were only 7 beeches now instead of 10, but the clump made a decorative and satisfying climax to the southern side of the valley. The other side of the Tanbitches Hill, as he knew from the maps, ran away in a gentle slope for 1.5 miles to the cliffs where Patrick Ashby had put an end to his life. Behind the lower rise of the valley, on the reverse slope of Clare Park, were farms that merged imperceptibly in 1 mile or 2 into the suburbs of Westover. In the slight hollow that marked the Clare Park slope from Tanbitches Hill was a path that led to the coast, the path that Patrick Ashby had taken on that day 8 years ago. It was suddenly more real to him than it had ever been so far, this tragedy which he was using to his advantage. More real even than it had been in the rooms that Patrick had lived in. In the house there had been other associations besides Patrick, associations more present and alive. There had been the distractions of human intercourse and of his own need to be constantly wary. Out here in the open and alone, it had a reality that it had never had before. Up here, that straggling path on the other side of the valley, a boy had gone, so loaded with misery that this neat green English world had meant nothing to him. He had had horses like Timber, and friends and family, and a belonging place, and it had all meant nothing to him. For the first time in his detached existence, Brat was personally aware of another's tragedy. When Loading had first told him the story in that London pub, he had had nothing but contempt for the boy who had had so much and could not do without that little extra. A poor thing, he had thought. Then Loading had brought those photographs to Kew and had shown him Patrick, and he had had that odd feeling of identification, of partisanship. "This is Pat Ashby. He was about 11 there," Loading had said, his feet propped comfortably on the railings of the park, and had passed him the piece of paper. It was a snapshot taken with a Brownie 2A, and Brat had accepted it with a curiosity that was active but not urgent. But Pat Ashby had not been the anonymous poor thing that he had so far held in his mind. He had been a real person, a likable, real person. A person who would have been, Brat felt, very much his cup of tea. From being vaguely anti-Patrick, he had become Patrick's champion. It was not, however, until this moment of quiet above Latchett's that he had been moved to sorrow for him. Clink, clink, came the faint sound from the valley, and Brat's eyes traveled down from Tanbitch's to the cottage at its foot. The blacksmith's, that was, a quarter of a mile west of the village. A tiny black square by the roadside it had been on the map. Now it was a small building with a black chimney and an occupant who made musical sounds with a hammer. The whole scene was very like the picture from which he had acquired his first-year French. Voilà le forgeron. It needed only a curé coming from the church and a postman on a bicycle between the forge and the village. Brat slid from Timber's back. From long habit loosened the girths as if he had saddled up hours ago, and sat down with his back to the gorse and juniper to feast his eyes on this primer of the English countryside. And that is the end of part 6 of Brat Farrar by Josephine Tey. So next week at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails, we will continue with part 7. Thank you so much for being with me. I really hope you're enjoying this, as I say each time, but I so love this book. So anywho, thank you indeed, and I will see you next week. Good night for now.